So this morning we're going to continue a journey, a very important journey for me, and I hope for you. And the journey is understanding how the rhythms of life. And with the life of Nehemiah that we've been studying over the last number of weeks, we see a man that God put something deep in his heart that didn't go away. He heard about Jerusalem and the disgrace and all that was going on. And not for the first time. He would have heard it before. But this day, when he heard about the plight of a people far away from where he was, that it gripped his heart and that drove him to weeping and praying. And he came out of that time with a resolve to do something. You know, life needs to direct us to God, and we go to God first. But as we go to God, that he will direct us to take action. And what I love about Nehemiah, he was an activist. Or whatever it was that God did and put in him was so deep that I got to do something about this. So he dares to go to the king. He was a cupbearer to the king. And in that case, you would never bring sorrow or sadness in the presence of the king. He risked his life to go before the king, not in a good place. He had obviously earned favor with the king, current King Artaxerxes, real king in time and space in history, very historical reality here. And he goes for it. You ever been there where something just doesn't go away and you got to do something? You don't know what to do, but you got to do something. So he goes to the king with a plan, and the king surprisingly says, you know what? Let's do it. Now, what if Nehemiah had gotten this far without a plan, without thinking that there'd possibly be the possibility of yes? I think sometimes we would be like Nehemiah when he's praying and agonizing and gripped with this thing, but it's like, I can't say this because it's going to be a no. One of the things we learned last week is don't say no for God by not asking. And that's what so many of us do. We say no to God by not asking God for what we're assuming that was going to be no. We do that with people. We do that in life. And Nehemiah, something happened. He's not willing to do that. He's willing to risk his life, his comfort, life, the status quo. That I got to go for this thing. I don't know what's going to happen. But he goes before the king, and he's actually got a plan just in case the answer is yes. And lo and behold, guess what happens? The king says, go do this. He gives him everything he needs. He goes to Jerusalem, begins to walk the streets of Jerusalem by himself, and he gets his heart crushed even more. He has to see for himself. See, Christian faith was never meant to be lived at a distance from the people that God loves. Nehemiah wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. And he didn't just come up and show up to town. There's never fear Nehemiah's here. But he walks the streets of the city. And he sees with his own eyes what he had felt in his heart when he heard the news. And then he goes before the leaders. You see, if Nehemiah only had a vision and it stopped with that and he couldn't convince anybody else, then probably it wasn't from God, one. But secondly, nothing's going to happen. But what are the leaders going to do? And surprisingly, the leaders said, you know what? We can do this. But he approaches them very uniquely. He says, yeah, we're in disgrace here. We got a problem here, but let us rebuild. He became one with them. Sometimes we have an us-them mentality in the Christian community. It's us, against everybody else, and God's on our side, and it's so unhelpful. But Nehemiah becomes one of them and engages them in that way. He says, we can do this. Sometimes we need somebody from the outside of our circumstance to look into our life and say, you're for more than this. You ever had anybody do that to you? There's more in you than you see in yourself. And maybe we dismiss ourselves because of things that have happened in our life, maybe mistakes we've made, sins we've gotten engaged with, addictions, or just life stuff. And we've assumed certain things. And we need somebody to come along and say, wait a minute. And one of the things we're learning through our study in Nehemiah is that God is an interrupting God. Yeah. He wants to, and I think he's doing it in our church right now. I think he wants to interrupt our church and our course. I think he wants to interrupt your life and my life because he's got something more than we would choose for ourselves. And he's doing that right now. And he's engaging us right now. And he's offering us another opportunity to step into his business and out of our business. And sometimes I wonder, God, why don't you just give up on it? Just do your thing with somebody else. But have you noticed that God comes again and again and he says, I have this for you. So guess what? The leaders, they say, you know what? We're in. We don't know why we're in or how we're in, but Nehemiah, we like your idea. But then the next step is where we hit today. What if the people vote no? A lot of times God votes yes, and he gives that a man or woman that vision and deposits it in her heart and life, and the leaders vote no, but then the leaders vote yes. But sometimes the people need to vote yes too. And churches can vote no on what God has for them. Did you know that? God could have something for you and me in this church or any church, and I can vote yes, but if you vote no, nothing's going to happen. So now what is going to be the next step? So in chapter 3 is a whole chapter of people whose names I can't pronounce, and I'm not even going to try. And they seem obscure. It's just all these listing of people that vote yes. And they vote yes in a very interesting way because they sign on and then they're assigned tasks according to their ability. It's not whatever. It's just like somebody says, I can do this. Well, I can do this. Well, I can do that. Well, I can help over here. Well, I'm a bricklayer. Well, you know what? I can bring the food. I can do this. And all of a sudden, everybody got excited about the vision, about change, about what could be. Because one person comes to town not prophesying what's wrong, but what's right and what can be. And it begins to turn the tide because the leaders voted yes. And now the people are stirred and say, yeah, let's do it. What do we got to lose? We're a mess. We're a mess already. Now, that's an interesting kind of situation here because without the leaders voting yes, without Nehemiah getting off his knees and being willing to take a risk and putting it all on the line, going to the king, without the king saying yes by having the favor of the Lord, without the leaders saying yes, and now the people saying yes, the wall wouldn't have been rebuilt, the gates not restored, and the book of Nehemiah never written. And I think about chapter 3, and I encourage you to read it. It's all these different people, and it's just like, you know what? These guys were obscure. Nobody knows them. But 2,500 years later, their names are in the Bible. I wonder how many of us, my name's not in the Bible. I've been looking everywhere for it. I just can't find it. And these obscure people in the Bible for us to read about 2,500 years later. And they might have seemed insignificant in the moment. I think that happens with us sometimes. We feel that our contribution to anything is just insignificant, and so it doesn't matter whether I bring what I have to the table or not. It really doesn't make a difference. You're so wrong if you think that. Because the church has been anemic because the idea of everyone gets to play, which is a very vineyardism, is got to be more than a token. If we come together, what could happen? What might God do? If there are a group of people that dare to believe God, trust in God, take a step out of where they are to what God has put before them and do it, bringing whatever they have to the table, what might we be able to accomplish? I don't think we've seen it. One more note before we go on. Not everybody voted yes. There's always some that don't. But it was the leaders, the nobles of Tekoa, 11 miles outside of Jerusalem at this time. And I don't know why. Maybe it's just they didn't want to get their hands dirty. Maybe they thought they were too good because they were leaders. Or maybe because they were afraid because, as you'll find out, it's like the counterattack and all this, and what's going to come against them is huge. And maybe they say, you know what? Life is just good enough. It's not great, but we're nobles and it's all right. I don't want to mess up the status quo. Boy, that can be so destructive when we fight for the status quo. When we fight for the way it's been because of fear of change, the fear of what could be, the fear of if I do this and I step into this and what's going to happen, you get all that, and then it's almost, get back in your place. And that's what the evil one's trying to do to you and me and this church and any church. Know your place and stay in your place. Stay right there. That's who you are. That's all you're going to be. Don't even think about more. So we end up wasting up our life. So game on, Nehemiah chapter 4. Here we go. So Sanballat was very angry. Now those were the enemies, the three enemies were identified earlier that are going to be adversaries and hounding Nehemiah all the step of the way. Remember, every time you say yes to God, every time you step out from where you are to where you want to go, you will be opposed. Count on it. Sometimes as Christians that we think it's like if something's hard or something's heavy coming down on me that I've missed God, and so we turn away from that. Well, there's not going to be any turning away because Nehemiah resolved. He knows what God has given him to do, and it's not going to be, and whether he continues or not, it's not going to be based upon how life is going to go. So Sanballat was very angry when he learned that we were rebuilding the wall. Again, these are Nehemiah's memoirs, his account of this whole deal. And he flew into a rage, and he mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan army officers, "What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do they think they can build a wall in a single day by just offering a few sacrifices? Do they actually think they can make something of stones from a rubbish heap and charred ones at that? And Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside them, remarked, yeah, that stone wall would collapse even if a fox walked along the top of it. Just a little pause. There's a voice when you step out. Who do you think you are? I know you. Look at your life. Look at how you did this and did that. What are you thinking? Get back. Get back in your place. And so the challenge here is that intimidation, that challenge to draw back. And Nehemiah's response is very important. He said, then I prayed. Man, I'll just be honest. I wish my response was like this all the time. Every time something came against me or happened, I would just pray first. It's like, I think I would say, what are you guys talking about? We're going to do, I would start going after these guys. But he said, then I prayed. Listen to his prayer. This is kind of a shocking, it's like some of you are going to think, can I really pray like this? Is this illegal? Listen to this. Hear us, O our God, for we are being mocked. May their scoffing fall back on their own heads. And may they themselves become captives in a foreign land, like we are. May what's happened to us happen to them. Do not ignore their guilt. Do not blot out their sins, for they have provoked you to anger here in front of the builders. It's almost like saying, well, if I can pray like that, I can pray. I can do that kind of thing. But you're going to see a pattern that's emerging right here. He prayed and he persisted. He didn't just pray and give up. He didn't back away. He didn't just try to fight his enemies. He didn't just start talking back and engage, in the rhetoric. He prayed and then he persisted. Interesting that before Nehemiah ever said a word to his critic, he talked to God first. Boy, that's a great thing to do. When you're having an argument with your spouse or a friend or a situation or something's come up at work, or it's just like, before saying a word to a critic, he talked to God. And as a result, he refused to retaliate. But he stayed the course. The temptation is when we engage in all the criticism and stuff that comes against us, guess what happens? You're off task. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing because you're engaged in all the critics. And what about, and you should be, and why didn't you, and all those. I know what that's like. My tendency is to defend and justify. I wonder what yours is. First, I want to defend myself, and then I want to justify and my action. Anybody like me? 1, 2, 3, okay. You're all like me. We all do that in crunch time. And it happens. Nehemiah doesn't do that. I've been 40 years in full-time ministry now, and I've learned that the hard way that the worst thing I can do is fight every critic one by one. Because I do that long enough and often enough, I forget what I'm about. I forget what I'm supposed to be about. And I get distracted and diverted from what God has given me. And then God loses, and then I lose, and the critics win. So that's really a deal here. Someone once said, I don't know who, that critics demoralize, but leaders encourage. I think, and direct, and lead the way, and go the way. Theodore Roosevelt, talking about critics, said, it's not the critic who counts. Not the man who points out how strong the man stumbles or where the doers of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasm, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. And sadly, my friends, I think that's a picture of the church today. We don't know victory and we don't know defeat because we're fighting for some status quo that is not life-giving and life-changing and doesn't make a difference in our world. One of the things that that I'm captured by. At the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, by doing something that matters, by breaking free, getting out of the cage, out of the box that we've been put in, that we put ourselves in. And I think the church has found ourselves, our church and the church at large, we've been held up in a cage. And we have the key and we still stay in the cage while the world is desperate for what we have. So Nehemiah's critics are rising up. You can't do this. You're stupid. What are you thinking? At last it says the wall was completed to half its height around the entire city, for the people had worked with enthusiasm. So they stayed on task, and the leader, Nehemiah, kept them on that. Sometimes the biggest danger is starting, but the next issue that we had is about halfway through. About halfway through, then it's easy to lose heart, and that's what begins to happen here. And the adversaries are right here. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the work was going ahead and that the gaps in the wall of Jerusalem were being repaired, they were furious. Not everybody's going to be excited about what God does in your life. Have you figured that out yet? The doomsayers are still going to be there. What are you thinking? And it says they all made plans to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw us into confusion. So now it's beyond the chatter. It's not just talk. We're coming at you. We're coming to take you out. We're going to stop you from doing this thing that you think God has put in your heart to do. And so the threats now were becoming more than verbal. And Nehemiah's response, again, but we prayed to our God and guarded the city day and night to protect ourselves. Now, what happens at this point, so the enemies are saying, now we're coming after you. Now, think of how you would feel. You're on a project, you're doing something you believe God has given you to do, you've stepped into it, and now your enemies are threatening to take you out, take your kids out, take your family out, you're married in our context. Now listen to this part. Then the people of Judah began to complain in the midst of this. Now next week, we're going to talk about how disunity can really be the very nature of what can destroy a vision. But for now, they began to complain. The workers are getting tired. And there's so much rubble to be moved. We will never be able to build the wall by ourselves. So now burnout had set in, and fatigue, and they were overwhelmed with the task. Here's what happens, my friends, and I've seen it many times, experienced it personally. You get started, and you're going for it, and you're making some progress, and then you see there's so much in front of you. You look at the world, there's so much going on in the world. So you think of your life and you get overwhelmed by what's not. And you forget what is. You forget what God has done. You forget where you were and where you are now. And you begin to just focus on the reality of the future, and you get overwhelmed by it. And the whole idea is to turn you back. The plan of the evil one is to make you quit. It's not about how I don't think the quality of your life and how good this or that is, or bad, or what. It's just like, will you quit? And I think that's really the deal. And so they're into it. It's like, what are we going to do? And the enemies take advantage. When you're at your weakest point, remember when Jesus, after he was baptized, went into the wilderness? At his weakest point, the devil comes. If you are the Son of God, turn these stones to bread. At his weakest point, dance for me. Prove yourself to me. And that's exactly what happens here. Meanwhile, our enemies were saying, before they know what's happening, we will swoop down on them and kill them and end their work. So now it's not just empty threats, it's a plan, it's a strategy. And Nehemiah is aware of it. Now listen to verse 12, kind of interesting here. The Jews who lived near the enemy came and told us again and again, they will come from all directions and attack us. It's like, yep, that's right. This isn't just theory. They're planning. They're going to do this thing. And so what do you do when something like that happens? Take your kids and run? You know, what were we thinking? And so Nehemiah, having prayed, he does what we need to do. See, he had resolved from the beginning that he wasn't going to quit. Boy, I wish we'd have that in our marriages. I wish we'd have that in the things that are in our life, that we resolve hell or high water, whatever it is, I'm not quitting. I'm not going back. I'm going forward. And when you decide that, and you have opposition and challenge and stuff that, gets in your face, then it's not, should I continue or not continue? Should I quit or should I run? It's, what do I do? And that's what happens here. It's like, we're not going back. So he said, I placed armed guards behind the lowest parts of the wall in the exposed areas. I stationed the people to stand guards by families, armed with swords, spears, and bows. I think that's interesting. He put them by families. You know why he did that? Because he knows families will stand together. They won't bail for each other. I thought that was very strategic because, when it gets hard and stuff, I don't know you, you don't know me, let's run, let's get out of here. But he had them by families out of relationships. I think there's a great picture of church and relationship, of being together in this, that we stand with each other. It says, then as I looked over the situation, I called together the nobles and the rest of the people, and I said to them, don't be afraid of the enemy. Quite a statement. Why would he say this? Because there's reason to be afraid. You ever heard that thing, be afraid? Be afraid? Say, I'm not afraid of anything. Well, that's stupid. Because there's things to be afraid of. So they were afraid. And they were afraid of the enemy. They were stricken by fear. But the decision was not the fear, is how they're going to respond to that fear is going to decide their future. And then he says, remember the Lord. He said, you start there. All right, you guys are afraid. I think he was saying, I'm afraid too. This is crazy. And I've been afraid before. When Nehemiah went before the king, remember? In fear and trembling he went. He says, we start by remember the Lord, who is great and glorious. What has God done? Who is he? That's where you make your stand. Are you hearing me? And not who you are, but who God is. And God has brought you here. God has brought you this far. He's not going to abandon you now. And then he says, so remember the Lord and then fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. It's not about fight for yourself. Fight for each other. Be there for each other. There's a sense of calling that Nehemiah is speaking, a great picture of the church today. That we're not called to fight alone. That I come alongside of you. You fight for me, I fight for you. You fight for my kids, I fight for your kids. We're going to have our kids come in a little while. We're going to pray for them as they go back to school. And most of them aren't going to be your kids. But will we give ourselves to each other, to other sons, to other daughters? And I think it's powerful that he's saying, for this to work, we got to remember the Lord, give him our fear, and we need to fight for each other in this. And so Nehemiah challenges not to be afraid. Now listen to the response. When the enemies heard that we knew of their plans and that God had frustrated them, we all returned to work on the wall, which is the goal. That we're going to have to change course. We're going to have to do things different. A lot of times we don't want change. We don't want to do things different. And we hold on to what we have. Churches can do that. They don't make that mid-course correction. We've made them many times. And we're about to make another one. That we can't just do what we've always done because it doesn't fit anymore. It doesn't work anymore. And so they had a plan to get to this far to get the wall, halfway up and getting this far along in the journey. But now they had to change course here. The enemies backed off when they heard something that maybe the evil one needs to hear from you sometime. That they weren't going to roll over. Said, all right, you're coming. Well, we're not leaving. We're going to get to building because that's what we were called to do. Stay on task with what God has given us to do. And so take your best shot. But we're not leaving and we're not rolling over for you. We are called to make a stand. Let our enemies know that we're not backing down. And it's not by attacking them. It's about doing what we are called to do. I love what Paul said to the Romans, not returning evil for evil, but overcoming evil by doing the good that we have been called to do. And the church has lost its way in the public arena of society right now. We get diverted by seeing you're our enemy, and fighting stupid battles and saying, what are we for? And doing more of that. That's another talk. Maybe next week we'll talk about that. But from then on, Now the strategy. Only half my men worked, while the other half stood guard with spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. The leaders stationed themselves behind the people of Judah, who were building the wall. The laborers carry on their work with one hand supporting their load and one hand holding a weapon. I think that's quite a picture. Anybody working construction? You ever had to go to work with a hammer in one hand and a gun in the other hand, or a sword? Can you imagine what that's like to have to spend a day doing that? I mean, I'm not one of those guys, because I'm more the guy that goes to work with the sword. I just destroy everything and have to stay away from construction sites altogether. They see me coming, they have special signs, pastors and Rick Olmstead particularly don't come near a hammer or whatever. I'll just go on and get off. I just interrupted myself. You ever done that? I mean, I'm quite, I don't need you to interrupt me. I can do it myself. All the builders had a sword belted to their side. The trumpeters stayed with me to sound the alarm. Then I explained to the nobles and the officials and all the people, the work is very spread out. We are widely separated from each other along the wall. Now, when you hear the blast of the trumpet, rest to wherever it is sounding. Then our God will fight for us. There's a couple big things in there that I think has the context for them and for us. Sometimes within our lives, within the Christian community, there's some of us that we get blown up by life. Maybe it's cancer. Last Friday, we did a memorial for a 4-year-old child that had died, that had drowned in Kentucky from our church. And that was very sobering. And what I think about at times like that, we rally there, and we rally here, and we rally there. And so he was saying, where the wall is weak and where we are weak, when you hear this sound, we all rally to where we are weak. And then we strengthen the weak, and then we move over here. What a great picture of what the church needs to be. But we only can see that picture if we're in the fight. They were engaged, and so they could fight again, so they would recover. And then they also noted, Nehemiah says, then our God will fight for us. He recognized that ultimately the fight is the Lord, that he will fight for us, that we make our stand, but it's the Lord our God will fight for us, but we fight for each other. Then he says something else in closing for today. We worked early and late, from sunrise to sunset. I want you to catch this. They weren't getting paid a salary, by the way. And then you get overtime after 8 hours. They worked early and late from sunrise to sunset. And you know why? Because they believed in something. They believed in what they were doing mattered. And they were willing to sacrifice and pay the price and do what needed to be done. He says, I also told everyone living outside the walls to stay in Jerusalem, because it was really dangerous and their lives were on the line. That way they and their servants could help with the guard duty at night and work during the day. During this time, none of us, listen to this, none of us, not I, my relatives, nor my servants, nor the guards who were with me, ever took off our clothes. Now, when I first read that, I thought, why is that in the Bible? Why do I need to know whether you change your clothes and your servants? It's like a big deal. Oh, okay. You guys, none of you took your clothes off at night. You just slept in your clothes and you woke up in your clothes. Why do I need to know that? And he said we carried our weapons with us at all time, even as we went for water. Well, let me tell you, it's because they were all in. And let me tell you, if we're going to make a difference in our world, if Jesus' prayer is going to get answered, when he taught us to pray about his kingdom come and coming, if God's going to get what he wants today, it's going to be somebody to lay down their life for that to happen. The wall would have never happened. It was great at the beginning, provided, yeah, we can do this. But now it's put up or shut up. And now they were tired. Now the enemies were threatening against them. Everything was working against them. But there was something inside of the people by this point, and a leader that helped facilitate that. They believed in what they were doing. Do we believe in the gospel that we proclaim? The good news of Jesus Christ for our world today. Sometimes if we look at the way that we live our lives and spend our time, energy, and our money, it doesn't necessarily say that we believe in it all that much. But I believe that our cause is the greatest cause on earth, the cause of Jesus Christ through his people, the church. And I don't think it's ever changed. But that's what it takes to make a difference, my friends. And we see a great picture of it started with God inspiring, putting something right here that didn't go away, and a man that tended to that and prayed his guts out and wept his eyes and then dared to do something about it. And I think we have a great pattern. In closing, I want to ask you a couple questions to personalize this. I love the fact that we're talking about a story 2,500 years ago, and God was there. And we're reading about it today, 2,500 years later. But the God that was with Nehemiah is the same God that's with us in our generation, in this time. And I think he's calling us to something more and wanting to interrupt your life and my life for something more. If you want the something more. I missed one thing. Is there a situation in your life that's paralyzed you with fear? Maybe real stuff. It stopped you. You were going somewhere. You were heading down a path. You were moving. You were shaking. Mover, shaker, and that kind of thing. You're doing it. And then something happened that caused fear to overwhelm you. Maybe fear of, of loss or something. Have you allowed the critics in your life to sidetrack you, to rob you, to steal what God has for you? That you believe something strongly right here, and you got talked out of it because somebody told you couldn't do it, or because they did something. The critics won the day and changed your narrative. Nehemiah challenged his fear with prayer and action, and so must we. We challenge the fear. Fear is fear. And sometimes, it's like, be afraid. Okay, there's things to be afraid. But that cannot be the deciding factor whether we do or whether we don't. Whether we ask God or whether we don't. Fear was present in Nehemiah when he went to Artaxerxes. And even in the moment, he was afraid. Real fear. But it didn't stop him from daring to ask God. Sorry. 2 Timothy 1:7. For the Spirit God gave us. For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. I just wonder about that self-discipline and that sound mind, self-discipline. It means that God has given me what I need to have to accomplish the task that he's given me. That's what he told Timothy. Because Timothy was full of fear, or he wouldn't have talked to Timothy about fear and his young disciple. He said, Timothy, don't let fear rule you. God has not given you a spirit of fear, but of power, love, self-discipline. You can do this if you choose it. Some of you, you're here today, and you believe, or you used to believe, that God put something in you. There was something you believed deeply, maybe passionately, that you hoped for, longed for. You could just see it coming, and then it waned. After a while, it got lost. But you know what happens? There's still those the reality is that some of that just sticks. You might have walked away from it. Maybe your critics have turned you away from it, but it still burns. That you're for something more. That there's something that God has for you. There's something left undone. There's a dream to pursue. And lastly, I'd say, what have you said no to by not asking? Or what are you saying no to now that you used to ask, but you don't ask anymore? Because faith asks, even a mustard seed of faith. And what I feel, one word that God is saying to our church, stop saying no for me. Let me say no if it's no. But don't you say no for me. Ask. Ask. Nehemiah wanted to know by asking about Jerusalem. And then he began to ask God, what do I do with what you placed in my heart? And God gave him something to do. And then he made the choice to do it. Let's stand.